So, where were we? We left off last week with the ex-surgeon, guilt-ridden Frederick, the Swedish former surgeon, meeting his daughter for the first time, introduced by the mother of the daughter who's dying of cancer. Frederick has met her now. She's 37, 38 years old, approaching 40. It's an experience. Today, she takes him to meet a friend of hers, a fellow exile in this sort of bohemian village that they occupy where she lives. His name is Giaconelli Matteotti. I don't think that's Swedish. How do you say that, Jerry? I'm sorry, we were looking at her. Giaconelli Matteotti.
Very good. You just have to shake your hand.
Giaconelli Matteotti. Not Swedish, but I think I did a little of that towards the end of that. But he's a shoemaker. He's a master craftsman. He's an old man who has been making shoes by hand, truly handcrafted, for all kinds of people around the world, including several popes. When they come to Giaconelli's home, they come inside and they find him in his workroom with a pair of shoes in front of him as he's shaping them and working on them. And Louise, the daughter, comes over and kisses him on the top of his bald head. And he doesn't see them, doesn't hear them coming in. He's got opera music going, of course, in the background as he's working. And he looks up and sees her, and he lights up. He's just delighted to see her. And he goes and turns down the music, and she introduces her father to him. And the exchange goes like this. "This is my father," said my daughter. "He's come back after all these years." "A good man always comes back," said Giaconelli. He had a thick accent. I should have you reading this, Jerry. He stood up and shook hands. "You have a beautiful daughter," he said. "She's also an excellent boxer." That's part of the fun of the story. She's a boxer. "She laughs a lot, and she helps me whenever I need help. Why have you been hiding yourself away?" He was still grasping my hand. His grip became even tighter. "I haven't been hiding away. I didn't know that I had a daughter." Deep down, a man always knows if he has a child or not. "But you have turned up. Louise is happy. That's all I need to know. She's been waiting for long enough for you to come walking through the forest to visit her. Perhaps you've been on your way all these years without realizing it. It's just as easy to lose your way inside yourself as it is to get lost in the woods or in a city." It's a good book. Italian Shoes is the name of it, Jerry. You might want to read this. Even if it wasn't a good book, it would be worth reading for that last line, that observation. It is just as easy to lose your way inside yourself as it is to get lost in the woods or in a city. Is that what happened to Thomas? Did he get lost inside himself, inside his grief, inside his shame, his guilt, his failure, his pain, his loss? Is that why he missed the meeting? Now, in Thomas's defense, and I have felt a kinship with Thomas that goes back to probably junior high years when I first heard the story and paid attention to it. Maybe it was high school. I felt like Thomas and I had something in common. He had questions, he had doubts. Now, in his defense, there was no memo that there was going to be a meeting. There was no email, no notice went out. So he didn't know this was happening. But John tells us it is Easter Day, the first Easter, the original Resurrection Day. It's the end of the day. It's evening. It's the close of the first day of the new creation. There's a new creation story coming into being told, being created right now that Thomas doesn't know about, that the disciples are about to discover. They themselves are locked in a room in fear of, and in the text, I read it differently than the text says. It says they're locked in their room because of their fear of the Jews. What nationality and religion are the disciples? Jews. They're Jews. So it would be like saying the Southern Methodists are locked away for fear of the Northern Methodists, or the Christians of this kind are locked in their room because they're afraid of those Christians. And it could be, it's possible, but they're afraid of the Judean authorities who have power, who are in cahoots with the Romans, who helped to engineer Jesus' execution. That's who they're afraid of, and they're afraid that the same thing could happen to them. That's why they're behind locked doors. Jesus comes among them, even though the doors are locked. He moves like a ghost through locked doors and walls, and yet he has these visible physical wounds that they can touch, that they can feel. What John is telling us is that we are off the map here. We're moving into a time, a way of life, a way of being that is uncharted. This is a whole new thing, is what he's saying. When Jesus appears, he says, "Peace be with you." He probably said, "Don't be afraid." Peace be with you. And he says that twice, and he shows them the wounds, and perhaps they have to touch them and feel that he's real, and they are excited and pleased, and then he breathes on them. He breathes on them. What does that evoke? Remember the creation story where God shapes the human being and probably lifts it up and breathes life into it? This is a retelling of that story. It's a refashioning of the story itself, and Jesus brings the breath of God. That's what has lived in him. That's how he has lived, what he's lived by. He breathes that into them and then says, now you are in charge of sins, whether people are forgiven or not. You get to decide what is held and what is forgiven, what is set free. This is an early church problem. When people do things that are destructive to the community, how do we handle that? Do we send them away? And what is the particular sin or sins that mean people have to go? Because you can't stay, the body will be damaged if you stay. So that ongoing conversation, we're still having it today. We're still trying to decide what's sinful and what's not, and who's in and who's out, and who can do what and who can't. So it's been going on from the start. So what John is talking about is a reflection of that early community. But Thomas isn't there. Why not? Well, Elaine Pagels writes in the book Beyond Belief about what she sees as a tension, sort of a dispute between John's community and the people who would surround Thomas and his philosophy. In the Gospel of John, the emphasis, or at least one of the strong emphases, is on belief, to become believers. And it's not just to accept a list of things that, yeah, I can believe in those things, but it's to trust into, would be maybe another way of saying it. It's to trust into this way of being and then become part of this community. So it's believing and belonging is what John really pushes in his gospel. And he's trying to help maintain a community, hold it together, so it makes sense that we have to believe together and be together in order to stay together and survive as a community. Thomas focuses on something rather different, that inner search in the individual, seeking the Christ within yourself. So we have a tension, we have a difference of views. And the story, the Easter story that John tells here, may suggest, now remember he writes about the year 90, 95, so it's 60 to 65 years or so after the time of Jesus. So things have changed and developed, and every one of the gospel writers writes the Easter story, like other stories, with their own intent in mind. So it may be that John tells this story to suggest that Thomas, because he is emphasizing this inner journey, that's what he's actually doing right now. He has departed from the community. He's gone away by himself to go within himself to deal with his grief and guilt and pain and all of that. He's abandoned the body. He's gone. He's not there. So, he doesn't receive the Spirit that the others do. He doesn't get the commission that the others do or the power that they have, John would tell us. But in the end, what happens? Jesus returns, right? Jesus comes again. Is this the second coming of Christ? In John's gospel, it may well be. It's certainly logical to think of it and see it in those terms. And he comes back specifically for Thomas. And he invites Thomas, what do you need to become a believer? And Thomas has his questions answered, it would seem. And so then his confession is, my Lord and my God. Thomas sees the light, sees where he was wrong. He comes back into the community and all is well. And maybe circling back to that question of, forgiving sin, retaining sin, Thomas maybe is the first one welcomed back in after sinning against the community by abandoning them. It's a possibility. The lesson, or the moral of the story, it's not too late, right? It's not too late for Thomas. It's not too late for you. You can still get in on this too. But it still seems to be about belief. Getting past your questions, getting past your doubts, setting those things aside and stepping into this community of true believers. In other words, it's time to come to Jesus. And one of the traditional teachings in the church, in some parts of the church, has been there is no salvation outside of the church, no salvation outside of this community of faith. That serves the church well. As long as you're inside, as long as you believe the right things, even if you're a jerk, it doesn't matter. You're okay as far as God is concerned. You're okay as far as eternity is concerned. But what about who you truly are? What about your life? Believing things is one thing. But living those things, or where they take you, is another thing altogether. So back to Giaconelli, what does he say? It is just as easy to lose your way inside yourself as it is to get lost in the woods or in a city or in the church, or in a system of dogma or beliefs, or in a job, or in a relationship, or in a family, in a toxic setting that gobbles you up. Isn't that one of our problems, one of our issues? That we get lost in stuff, in things. And yet, if we don't take the risk of that inner journey, risk getting lost inside oneself, well then what is the purpose of living and what is the value of that life? What I'm suggesting is that this tension between the inner journey and the community is essential, and we're called to be about that inner seeking, searching journey within a community that itself is seeking and searching and open and moving and growing and living. I think that's key. So I have a sort of an Earth Day story for you, maybe to get you thinking in those terms. This happened a week ago, last Tuesday, Monday, that day when it was almost 70 degrees, and the entire world was out. Cabin fever was run rampant. People were everywhere. Well, I went for a walk that day, and it was even warm enough to walk in shorts. And I took this as about a 3-mile, 4-mile round-trip walk. And at one point, I walked through this park that's a little ways from us. It's a pretty little park with a stream running through it. And there were people everywhere. There were people walking individually and in groups. There were people walking dogs in groups. There were people biking. It was just people all over the place doing all kinds of stuff. And it was really rather irritating. I thought, what are you all doing in my park? And I actually felt that irritation. And so in the traffic, I decided to get, at one point, off the walking path, and I sat on a bench as people were going around. So I sit on this bench that faces southwest. So the sun is shining on me, and there's a little breeze. It's very faint. It is a perfect day. And as I sit there, sort of the irritation quiets, and I decided I'll just sit here and close my eyes, just because it's so beautiful. And so I sit with my eyes closed, and all of this sound, this activity is going on around me. I can hear the footsteps of runners and walkers. I can hear the jingling of dog tags as people go by with their dogs. I can hear the shh as bicycles shush by. There are ducks on the stream that are quacking. There are birds calling. The red-winged blackbirds are squawking at each other. There are some frogs in the distance. There's some traffic noise even further distant, and I hear a motorcycle wrapping up, and there are human voices around me as people talk. And as I'm hearing this, I'm feeling this warm sun on my face and this gentle, soft breeze against my skin. And in that moment, for just a moment, all those separate things, they all came together as one. It was this sweet unity, and it wasn't a bunch of different things competing. It was all coming together as one thing. And sitting in the center of it all for just a moment, a few breaths, I disappeared. I was sort of absorbed into it all. I just ceased to be, sort of evaporated into this completeness, into this wholeness. And I had no worries about anything. I was not anxious about COVID. I was not thinking about any of that. There was none of that going on. Everything was gone. It was just everything coming together. And there was this contentment, this peace that I have never known before. It was so marvelous. It was absolutely glorious. It was like a heavenly moment, I suppose. And I did nothing to earn it. I didn't do anything to cultivate it. I just happened to sit down, and it just happened. It was this gift. It was this grace. Frederick Buechner says it's all grace. It's all grace, and once in a while it comes through. Well, as soon as I realized, oh, this is what's happening, boom, it's gone. And I'm back to thinking about myself and my worries. But later it struck me. That was the meeting. That was a manifestation, a version of the meeting that Thomas missed, that Christ comes back to provide for him that second time. That was the meeting. It was one version of it, where the risen one or the risen oneness of God comes to meet us to help us know our place, our belonging, even in our separateness and our uniqueness and our divisions and our differences and all of that. And the tension between believing and searching, between community and individual, between being together and being apart, that is all part of it as well. It's necessary, and that belongs in the whole. God gathers all of that up into God's self. It all belongs. We all belong. So, if you feel like Easter slipped past you this time, if you feel like with Thomas you missed the meeting, don't be dismayed. Fear not. Peace be with you. Because Christ comes back again and again and again, seeking us, looking for us. And there are meetings being scheduled this very moment, and you're on the list. Peace be with you in Christ. Amen.